Well, who am I? I'm standing in front of you, of course. I've got a funny surname called Cienciala, and in Polish, the L has a dash through it, and it's pronounced Cienciała. So on my father's side, I was Polish. On my mother's side, I was German. So I've got a bit of both. But unfortunately, I've forgotten all my Polish, which is rather embarrassing when you meet other Poles. I was born in an area of Central Europe called Upper Silesia, which is where the Czech Republic, pre-war Germany, and Poland all met together. And in fact, part of on my father's side, the family came from the other side of the border in the Czech Republic, although it was in a Polish-speaking area. And my mother came from a town about 20 miles away called Bielsk or Bielsko, depending on whether you're German or not. And that was a predominantly German town. The population there was half German, half Polish, and then into the Czech Republic a bit Czech. So I've got a bit of both. And I do speak German, but as I say, unfortunately I've forgotten all my Polish, which I spoke as a youngster, and I'll come to that later. In 1939, the war broke out. Until then I had a reasonably happy childhood, living in a place called Katowice, which is maybe a name known to you. It's in the main town of the coal mining area of Upper Silesia. And then in 1939, my father saw that Hitler was determined to invade Poland and annex part of it. So he had an uncle living in a town called Lwów, which often appears nowadays in the news because it's no longer in Poland, it's now in the Ukraine. You might have seen it, it's LWOW or LVOV. And he had an uncle living there and cousin. So he asked them to arrange for a flat for him to live in with us. So we moved to there about a month or so before, or 2-3 weeks before the war started, only to find that after the Germans invaded on the western side of Poland, the Russians, by agreement with Hitler, between Hitler and Stalin, invaded Poland from the eastern side. And the next time I looked out, there were Russian soldiers in the town. So that rather put us in a difficult position. Not that it affected us as children very much. I've got a brother who's 1.5 years younger than me. And so my father said to my mother, well, there's no point staying here. I haven't even got any work here in Wolf. And so I've got no livelihood. I'm afraid to go back to my home area in case the Germans arrest me, and which they did actually, with a lot of the Polish educated classes. They arrested them and took them to concentration camps, either Dachau or in Austria in Mauthausen. And in fact, one uncle of mine was taken to Mauthausen in Austria, and due to the bad conditions there, he died there. But anyway, so my father quite rightly said, I'm going to stay behind in Wolf, but see if we can get permission for you to cross from the Russian-occupied part of Poland to the German part of occupied part of Poland. And so by a transit camp, we came to the border between the two, and it's one of the few childhood memories I've got. We in this transit camp where we had to wait to get permission to go to the German part, we were sleeping on the floor just on straw, no beds provided. But anyway, we then managed to carry on and came to my mother's father in a town called Bielsko, in our home area where she had grown up. He was a retired headmaster, and we lived right through the war with him. And actually, we never experienced much of the war. Fair enough, it was occupied by the Nazis, and provided you kept your nose clean, you were all right. Different for the Polish population. I'll give you an example. When my mother when we got to my grandfather's, probably late 1939 or early 1940, she wanted a job, her job as a teacher, and she was told she couldn't have it because she was Polish trained. In other words, you could only have a job as a teacher if you were trained in a German teacher training college. So she then wanted to do a secretarial job, and again she got nothing. And then somebody said to her, the problem may be that you're married to a Pole. So she asked for a divorce, which was easy enough to get if you were married to a Pole. If you were German, ethnically German, as my mother was, and it was easy enough to get a divorce from somebody who was Polish. And as soon as she had her divorce, the next day she had a job. It just shows how narrow-minded people are in dictatorships and politically too. Now, anyway, we then lived during the war with my grandfather and never saw really much of the war because we were miles away from the fighting. We were well out of range of bombers coming across from Britain or America or anywhere. So it was never bombed, and it still today hasn't any damage to the town of Bielsko. So that was our war years. My father, who had stayed behind in Wolf, in Lemberg, because he was afraid to go to the German part, and quite rightly, the Russians then did the same what the Germans had done. They arrested all the Polish intellectuals, and about 500,000 Poles were carted off to Karelia, which is in effect part of Siberia. Karelia is next to Finland, and he was there for 2 years, chopping down trees in the woods, badly fed, but he managed to survive it. If you didn't have good health, you wouldn't survive something like that. And then in 1941, Hitler, to Stalin's surprise, attacked Russia because they were friends until then, and because it was so unexpected, the German army was. The Germans invaded Russia in July, and it's a huge country. But by just before Christmas, the German troops were in front of the gates of Moscow and St. Petersburg. However, that's where they then came unstuck, because the winter came and everything froze solid. The German troops weren't properly clad. They were still in summer uniforms and not thick winter coats. And the tanks couldn't move because they were frozen in the mud. So the whole thing came to a standstill. But anyway, my father was there in Russia. And Stalin, however, badly needed help. So Churchill agreed to supply him with both guns and tanks via the North Sea convoys, which you must have heard of, on condition that all the Poles they had carted off to to Siberia and Karelia, as my father was, would be released. And in due course, but only in due course, not with the first lot, but in due course, my father was released. The Russians tried to hide how many Poles they had taken prisoner. So under pressure from the Polish government in exile in London, Churchill then put more pressure on Stalin, and the remaining Poles were released, including my father. And he was moved to Kazakhstan, and from Kazakhstan to Iran, and rehabilitated because they were all underfed, the Poles. And about 250,000 Poles, so certainly 200,000, then were brought by sea via South Africa because you couldn't travel through the Mediterranean because of the war in Libya. And the Mediterranean was therefore unsafe for Allied vessels. So he was brought via South Africa together with a lot of other Poles to Britain and to Scotland first of all. And he hadn't learned English, so he made it his job to learn English, and he made a good job of it. And he settled down in England. And because he was already getting on to 40, he was never called up in the Polish army. And the Polish army was quite an important arm of the West European fight against Hitler. They distinguished themselves in Italy, at Monte Cassino, and then again at towards the end of the war in Holland. If you remember the brigade which was at Arnhem and had crossed the bridge too early was a Polish brigade. So the Poles had distinguished themselves quite well, and that was recognized after the war. Anyway, my father, however, wasn't called up, and he lived in London. We were in Germany. And then I came home one day from school in mid-January 1945. I came home with my brother from school, and we were told, my mother said, "We're leaving today. We've just heard the Russian army has arrived in Krakow," which was about 30 miles away, probably 40 miles away, I'm not quite sure. We're going to try and get a train to central Germany, to Saxony, where we had relatives living. So she had already packed a couple of rucksacks and cases. And what I hadn't mentioned is my mother had remarried somebody who was originated from West Germany. It wasn't a particularly happy marriage anyway. It wasn't difficult for her. And she had already divorced my father. And she met this German soldier who was recuperating after being wounded in Russia. And the population was asked to invite people, soldiers who were recuperating, for Christmas dinner. So she said she would have somebody. And Emil Breuer turned up, and they had a lot of things in common. And they were both musical, they were both teachers, and so a friendship developed, and eventually they married. And as I say, his home was in West Germany, south of Dortmund, east of Cologne. So when, in 1945, we heard, as I say, we came from school, and we were told the Russians are in Krakow. My mother had already packed suitcases. She had, in the meantime, a child with a second husband, called Helga, but she wasn't quite a year old, so she had to carry the baby. And we each had a little suitcase and a rucksack on our backs with all our possessions. And my grandfather came with us and carried 2 cases and put us on one of the last trains from Silesia, from Katowice to Saxony, to the relatives there. So that was quite an experience. And the train was, of course, packed full with people fleeing from the Russian invasion. We then arrived in this place called Frankenberg, which is between Leipzig and Dresden. And we were there for about 6 weeks. And they've got a funny accent there, the Germans. I had great difficulty understanding the German they were speaking. But it wasn't a dialect, but it was a funny pronunciation, and it was partly a dialect, because I was for 6 weeks in school there. But anyway, and while we were there, Dresden was bombed, and it was about easily 30 to 40 miles away. But I remember the sky being all red towards the east where Dresden was, because it was just a fireball for 3 days. So that's one of the childhood memories I've got. And then my aunt's daughter lived in Dresden, and she was bombed out and had to come to her mother to live there. So we had to leave from there. In the meantime, the sister of my mother, so the older sister, had arrived at the place as well. And she joined us and helped my mother because of the suitcase and the rucksacks and having to carry the baby. And she helped us. And we traveled to Leipzig. And when we got to Leipzig, a big German city, it's got the biggest station in Germany. It's got 32 platforms. There was the sirens went, and we were told there's a bombing raid coming onto Leipzig. So we all were put into the bunkers below the station, into the area shelters below the station. And it was a heavy bombardment. And as a result, the station was badly damaged and no trains were running. So we were then transported, we had to walk to a school to stay overnight for a few nights in a school before we could travel on. And one thing I remember, going along the road there from the station to the school, there were houses still burning, and there were tall houses about 5 or 6 stories high, and the cases and other stuff were on a cart, on a horse-drawn cart, and the horse-drawn cart had just passed, and my brother was sitting on that as well, when one of the outer walls of a huge house fell right across the road, and only just missed the cart with the young children on and the suitcases on. Anyway, we got to the school, and once the trains were running again, which was about 4 days later, we then moved on first to Halle and stayed overnight there, and there was a bombing raid, and then to Kassel. I don't know if Kassel means anything to you. Kassel is south of Hanover. And and the train couldn't go any further because the line was, the main station was completely destroyed in Kassel. So we were all told to get out of the train at a suburban station and walk through Kassel to the other end of the town and catch a train from there. And I've never seen anything so badly destroyed. There wasn't a house standing. The roads were just simply cleared with a bulldozer and rubble heaped up on either side. I think in the whole of the town, which is a town of about 200,000 people, 150,000 people, there was perhaps 1 or 2 houses still standing. The rest was just rubble. And then from there we continued to my stepfather's home in West Germany, which is south of Dortmund, east of Cologne. And we lived there for the next 3 years. So that's the stage I've reached. My father, in the meantime, is in England. the end of the war came, and I remember that very well because we arrived in Ludenscheid, this place where my stepfather comes from, and his parents had a small farm there in beautiful countryside, very hilly, wooded, with lakes, and we really felt it was a beautiful place to live in. And so we lived there for the next 3 years, and I went to school there. And my father, in the meantime, in England, wanted to get in touch with us and find out where we were. And he got in touch with his mother, who still lived in Poland. She didn't know, but told him that his wife was married again, which was a shock to him. But I'm not surprised, because I think it was quite a difficult marriage. And he then, through various search agencies in West Germany, because there were about 10 million. Remember, we're talking about refugees coming to this country. You know, you're talking of a few 100,000 or so. But there were 10, in a population of 40 million in West Germany, 10 million on top of that were all refugees from the eastern part of Germany and from Poland and the Baltic countries and so on. So plus the fact a lot of the towns were completely destroyed, so there was very little accommodation, and it was really quite difficult there. Anyway, my father, through one of the search agencies, whether it was the Salvation Army or it might have been, anyway, he found out where we lived, and about 3 years after the war, in less than 3 years, autumn 1947, just before Christmas, British Land Rover, a British Army Land Rover turned up with my father sitting in it, being driven there, and that was my first contact with him again. And we'd forgotten what it was like. We hadn't seen him for 8 years, from 1939, from the time we left him in Wolf to the time we arrived to the time he arrived. And he then wanted custody of the two of us. My mother disputed it, but he was on the winning side. She's the one who had divorced him, and the divorce case came before a British tribunal, because we were living in the British zone, occupied British zone, and they decided in favour of my father. And that's how I came to England in 1948. And it was, on the other hand, in all fairness to the British judge, he did say that we would have to spend every summer holiday with my mother in Germany, so that she didn't lose, the relationship with us. In some ways, she should have been left with the custody, and we should have been coming to England for our holidays. But in fact, the judge, under pressure from my father, decided we should come to England and spend the summer holidays in Germany, which worked out very well, because with it just being 5 or 6 weeks with my mother, it was a real holiday. Whereas if we'd been there all the time, we would have had to go to school, after the evening to homework, and it wouldn't have been the same. So it all worked out well. God looked after us. Anyway, so we came to England, and my father had put us into a boarding school in Blackheath in London. He lived in London. That's one thing the judge said to him when he wanted custody. Mr. Cienciala, you're in a position to bring up 2 teenage boys. Because you're a bachelor. Oh, I've got a good friend, and we're going to get married in 2 or 3 months' time. And so I ended up with 2 homes, one in Germany, my mother and stepfather, and one in London, my father so one in Germany, my mother and stepfather, and one in London, my father and my stepmother, who was very British. She was from Cotswold country. So anyway, so we then lived in London, and that's where I finished my schooling, and then went to college to study my job, which I did, and which brought me up here to the northeast, which was land surveying. And I became a surveyor. And I got a job with the National Coal Board, open cast executive. And I was sent to work first in Durham for 2 years. And then when they had to cut down on staff there, because the coal industry was receding, because of the imported oil, which was cheaper, I was moved to Witherington, where there's some large open cast sites, and worked as a surveyor in the Witherington area, and on the open cast sites. Very interesting. One thing you probably may not know, that big open cast site between Witherington Village and Broom Hill, which was the biggest there was one seam of coal, which was solid, not worked before coal, of 6 foot high, 6 foot thick. There were other seams as well, but there was the one seam, the main of Broom Hill, had never been touched, because to the north was the Rift Valley, which had closed it off from the collieries to the north. To the south was the big fault, so the collieries to the south couldn't get in. And there was this huge household coal of 6 foot being mined, as well as some other coal. So that was quite an experience seeing that. Anyway, and while I was there, I managed to then change to the lands department, the estates department of the open cast executive, and worked as a estates officer, lands officer for them, and I loved that job. It took me all over the coal mining area of Northumberland, all over Durham and Cumbria as well. And that was really something I enjoyed very much. It was one of the high points in my life. And thank goodness for the coal board having a good superannuation scheme. I've been very comfortable since, because it is not deficient in money. And so anyone who'd worked for the coal board staff superannuation, I'm not talking about the miners one, I'm talking about the staff one, is reasonably well off. So that's more or less the story of my life. From a Christian point of view, my parents, on my mother's side, my grandfather wasn't particularly religious. My mother used to play the organ at church, and she had a faith at the time of a sort. But on my father's side, the family was deeply Christian. My grandfather, my father's father, and his wife, my grandmother, I never knew him because he died in 1936, were part of a house meeting and met weekly for prayer and Bible study. On my mother's side, her grandfather, which was another Cienciala, but slightly from another branch, and he lived near Bielsko, where my mother's father lived. And I've been to the churchyard in Bielsko, where the graves of of that family, of the Ciencialas is. And there are 6 or 4 large black marble headstones, and I mean large. They're a good 6 foot high. And one of those headstones, or two of them, had the names of 3 children who had died within 3 years of within 3 weeks of each other of scarlet fever. That shocked me really, that 3 children would die in those days of scarlet fever. We're talking of, when would that have been, late, about 1900 or so. And, was it? Yes, it would have been. Or early 1900s, around the time of the First World War. And then further along was his gravestone and that of his wife. And they say he lost 3 children. The only one which survived of the first children was my grandmother. And then he had more children. He had 4 other daughters, and they all survived. But on his gravestone, and 2 sons, he had 2 sons as well. One of them committed suicide, and one was killed in the First World War. And yet on his gravestone, at the bottom of it, it says, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." I absolutely was humiliated when I saw that and spoken to. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. What faith that man had. So there's the story of my life. If you want to know any more, I don't know. I don't know how long I've spoken.
I think that's great timing, actually, Tad. Oh, thank you very much indeed. I mean, we've got similar stories of refugees and evacuations and total destruction still going on today, sadly. But I mean, to hear this from first hand is just amazing. Do we have any questions for Tad?
Did you see the Brits as the enemy then?
So
did you see the Brits as the enemy?
Could you repeat that to me?
Did you see the British as the enemy?
Did we see British as the enemy during the war? Yes, because Hitler's Germany, and we'd been annexed to Hitler's Germany, was very much the press and media were controlled. And in fact, you had to be careful what you said during the war. Because if somebody overheard you criticizing Hitler's regime, you'd be in trouble. So,
obviously you were really impressed with your grandfather's faith, but what about your own personal experience?
How did you come to faith, Tad?
How did I come to faith? I was always drawn towards God. I think it's probably my Christian heritage, and I think that's an important point. Christian heritage, I think, does play a part. And I was always drawn to God. We weren't church people when we lived in Bielsko up to the age of 10, up to the age that we left there. And nowhere when we lived in West Germany, because the church was rather far away, and the folks on the farm didn't go to the church except at Christmas. And the same was in Bielsk. But I had a God consciousness always. And when I came to Britain, my father was a Christian, and he actually liked to go to Westminster Chapel to hear Martin Lloyd-Jones. And he used to go along with him sometimes. And then, when I was at college, we had a prayer group and a Bible study group, which met once a week. And we decided to go to All Souls London Place, and we heard John Stott. And at the end of the service, he made an appeal. And I considered myself a Christian, but I'd never sort of openly made a confession. So I went forward, and to sort of publicly display that I want to follow Jesus. And that was a definite turning point. There were 1 to follow-up sessions, and I learned a lot. And I definitely remember that I had a touch of God at that time. But before that, when I was 16, my mother wanted us, and my father as well, wanted us to be confirmed in the Lutheran Church, because in our area of Upper Silesia, half the population was Roman Catholic, half of them were Lutherans. So in West Germany, we went to the minister offered to give us confirmation lessons, and they really spoke to me. And when he laid his hands on us, it wasn't the bishop, it was in the Lutheran church, it's the Lutheran minister, laid his hands on me. I felt God was touching me. So that was another time. Yeah. And a third time was when I moved up to Durham. And the Christian, although I wasn't a student, I went to the Christian Union meetings. And the Durham Christian Union is one of the best in the country. It's a superb Christian union, fantastic speakers always, all the well-known names and of that time. And they had arranged a week's mission in St. Nicholas Church in the marketplace. And I went to that every night, and John Stott was the preacher. And I stayed behind on the Thursday and a good chat with him. But I still felt as if God was distant, and I was plagued with doubts. And in my despair, after the service, I walked away from the church up towards the cathedral, and you pass a college called Hartfield College, and in it is a little chapel where on a Saturday morning the Christian Union used to have a prayer meeting. I went in there, nobody was there, and I turned, just put the light on, and just was quiet before God. And peace came over me, an absolute peace came over me as I was there. And then some students came to say evening prayer, so I walked out. And as I walked out and down the road from Hatfield College down to the marketplace, I skipped along the road with joy. And when I got onto the bus to go to my lodgings in Promulgate Moor, I felt love for the bus conductress. And it wasn't because she was a woman, I just felt love. And the next day when I went to work, I felt love for the people I was working with. So there was peace, joy, and love, the 3 fruits of the Spirit. Amen. So that's my testimony.
Fantastic.